to the Communities of Practice first monthly webinar of the 2017-2018 school year. My name is Laura Mitchell, and I'm an innovation partner within the Imaginarium, which is the innovation lab in Denver Public Schools. And I'm joined by Meg McCormick, who is a director in the Imaginarium. And we are running our first webinar with a focus on relationships and culture. And I have Meg here today. She has a lot of expertise around relationships and culture and has done a lot of work through our district's program Growth Through Connections. And so she's going to go ahead and kick us off. We have a number of people who are able to join us today, and then we're also recording this. So for future webinars, which our next one will be in November, you're welcome to join us live, and I'll be sending out those. Meg is going to share some resources that she has put together, and then at the end we'll have lots of time for Q&A. So as she's talking, be thinking about what questions you may have for her at the end. Great. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and kick off.
Yeah. So hopefully you'll be able to see the slides that will be on the screen as we go along, and questions and comments at the end, which I think will give you all a chance to think about it, how it all works for your own practice. So as Laura said, we're with the Communities of Practice, and this is a monthly webinar series, and what we're looking at today is specifically relationships and culture. So this is a little bit about my background. I'm Director of Client Services in the Imaginarium, and the Imaginarium is Denver's innovation lab within Denver Public Schools. I have more than 20 years experience in education, both worked a lot in public and private schools as a teacher, school leader, literacy coach. I've been an educational consultant for Marzano, as well as personalized learning and school relationship coach. So part of the reason I want to draw some attention to the public and private school piece when we talk about relationships is how we get into this piece around the relationships that some of schools have in private schools with their students, which has been a lot of experience I've had also. So today with this webinar series, our goals would be that participants will increase their understanding of why cultural awareness and building relationships with students can increase learning. And our second goal would be that all of you as participants will learn of resources to increase cultural awareness and relationships in your own classrooms. So we always want to start with what the research says, so why cultural awareness and relationships is important. There is a lot of very substantial research about this. I have 3 bullet points here just to get us started with some of the research that talks about it. But one of the really big studies around the research is that cultural awareness and relationship building really can help engage students academically and socially in very productive ways. And I think that we also know, and there's a lot of research that's associated with the fact that behavior issues are reduced and kids are more engaged when they have a really tight relationship with their teacher. Positive relationships with teachers are important in supporting self-esteem, higher academic self-efficacy for students. And a third really important area is students in high poverty urban schools may benefit from positive teacher-student relationships even more than students in high income schools. And it's because of the risks associated with poverty. Resources, in addition to substantial research, there's also a lot of resources out there regarding books that have been written on the topic, as well as articles that have been written on the topic. And so I really want to draw attention to a book by Dr. Christopher Emdin, For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood, and the rest of y'all too. That's also a book that we're using with our Growth Through Connections program in the Imaginarium, which has to do with building relationships. The Importance of Teaching Through Relationships by Stacy Goodman is another great resource, as well as Creative Schools, The Grassroots Revolution That's Transforming Education, which is a Ken Robinson book that he co-authored with Lou Aronica. So I want to go back and dig a little bit into Christopher Emdin and For White Folks Who Teach in the Hood, because that is the work that we've done with Growth Through Connections, and it's a lot of our background information that we've had. Christopher Emdin specifically talks about reality pedagogy and talks about it being an antidote to the traditional top-down pedagogy. So this idea of reality pedagogy is how do students start driving their own learning, and how do students start having a voice in the classroom different than a traditional model. Embrace and respect each student's culture. So important. That's such a key piece. and reimagining the classroom as a site where roles are reversed and students become the experts in their own learning. So when we set up a classroom where the student is the expert, as opposed to an old traditional model where the teacher is the keeper of the information, we start to have cultural awareness and the relationships become much stronger. So it's all really easy to say and to talk about how we're going to have these relationships, but there's always this question about, how do I do this? How do I begin with cultural awareness and relationship building in my classroom today? So there's a number of different things that we've put together, and the first thing that I would say it all falls under is authenticity. And the first thing I have here is interviewing your students. And this is, I put personalized learning here because this is something we talk about a lot with personalized learning. So engaging in conversations with students to learn from and about them. Hear what they have to say. What are their ideas? What is their voice? Give them a voice. Provide choices for them. And that can be scaffolded in all different ways. I know I've had some funny conversations sometimes with a teacher who says, I can't give a kindergartner a choice if they should read or not. I'm like, that's not the choice that we give kindergartners, but provide them some choice so they can start to realize that their voice matters and their opinion matters. Ask them if the lessons that are taught are meaningful to them. How do they like to work? Do they want to work by themselves? Do they want to work in groups? We know that eventually we need to really help our kids learn to work in cooperative groupings, something they're going to have to do. Agree on the norms of the class. And this is a really good example out of Christopher Emdin's book. Is, for example, is a late assignment really late in the student's world? And if it is late and there's a penalty, then why do they even need to complete it? So those are norms to start bringing back to classrooms and asking them, what does late actually mean to them? Because you as a teacher, and to talk in Christopher Emdin's world too, in a white pedagogy world, what late might mean to you might be a very different thing than what late might mean to a student in your classroom. Incorporate what you learn into the class curriculum and teaching. And projects that allow students to share their experiences and interests. And that gets into a lot of real world authenticity. So Cosmopolitan Classroom is specifically out of Christopher Emdin's book. He talks a lot about it. And he talks about these different ideas for implementation. So what Emdin talks about with the Cosmopolitan Classroom is that you're creating a family structure and you're building community within the classroom. Talks about these bonds of a family structure and how you think about, we all have each other's back and we're all here to help everybody move forward in what we're learning in the classroom. He talks about culturally relevant strategies such as hip hop music and call and response. There's a lot of evidence around this call and response, and some of it goes back to the church and how there is often in a all-Black congregation church, there's a call and response type of engagement, and there's been a lot of research and evidence on that. Tie what's going on in your classroom to social, emotional, and physical functioning. Another really positive way. A Cosmopolitan Classroom idea is this idea of having roles and responsibilities in the classroom. If students have a particular role and a responsibility in your classroom, there's been a lot of research of showing increase in attendance. Kids come because they have an obligation and they have a role, and this family structure you've created in your classroom, they don't want to let the others down. So here's different ideas of a responsibility or a role someone could have in the class. They're in charge of arranging the desks. They're in charge, somebody else is in charge of teaching materials being organized. Somebody else is in charge of distributing equipment. Maybe you have the Chromebooks cart for the day and they're responsible for getting that out. Somebody else is responsible as actually the technology supervisor. So they might be in charge of helping people who have technology issues during the class period. An assignment collector. You, as a teacher, have an assignment and somebody needs to collect it. Somebody comes to the door, somebody has the role that they are the guest greeter. So if you imagine something around my role in the classroom as a guest greeter and I don't come one day to class, and somebody comes to the classroom and we don't have a guest reader. So I've let my family structure of my class down. Music coordinator, super good one. You can create playlists where you have different playlists. We need some music playing softly while kids are doing independent work. So who's in charge of that? And did they create and allow them to create the playlist? Often you need to let it needs to run through the teacher to make sure it's appropriate, but let them create the playlist. So another place where there's lots of resources for all of you is in the Imaginarium Relationship Resources, which is the Imaginarium Driver Model. And on there, we have the different suggestions of our resources in Schoology. So for each area of the driver model, there's places where you can go into Schoology and join the course. It's here on the slide, and access our resources for those different areas of the driver model.
And Meg, could you actually talk a bit, for those who may not be as familiar with the driver model, about the foundational practices? Because of course our webinar is focused on relationships and culture.
Yes.
Just a little explanation on that.
So on the screen right now, you can see the driver model, and the top piece is purple. If you were with us last year, you saw that we had just the areas below the 4 primary driver models in our driver model. And we talked a lot, though, as we went through the year about how these foundational practices were so crucial and important. And that's what this relationships and culture is, that we broke them out into their own areas of relationships, culture, mindset, and metacognition. And when we talk about relationships, then if you go, I'm just going to scroll down here, we broke these all out. And so we broke it out from a beginning standpoint to an advanced standpoint as far as having relationships. We defined it as all members contribute positively to the school community and work to build trusting, meaningful, and authentic relationships. So from a beginning stage, learners and teachers would not have opportunities in the classroom to share life experiences with others. And that moves all the way across the spectrum to an advanced stage where learners and teachers are openly and authentically sharing their identities and experiences. The same with culture, breaks out a little bit, also from beginning to advanced. Learners are primarily aware of their own learning and not aware of other learners and their needs, all the way to what we want is ideally in an advanced area around culture is the classroom would have learners that are aware of the other learners' needs and they would respond with empathy. Within our resources in Schoology, you would be able to see different types of things you could read, maybe videos you might see that would help you think about steps in your own classroom to move across that continuum.
Awesome. And for anyone who hasn't seen the driver model before, the bit.ly is up here for you to jump in. So it's bit.ly/PL driver model. If anyone wants to hop in there at any point.
We go to Schoology. Yeah. Okay. So, so that is the basic information, and I just wanted to open it up now for thoughts and questions that you all might have about this. And I put a few things in here if people wanted to talk about those. Has anyone implemented or tried any similar ideas in their classroom around building relationships? Or has anyone tried something that they'd like to share or get feedback on?
So from there, we're just going to go ahead and open it up to questions. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to jump in if you want to answer any of Meg's questions, or if you have a different question or clarification or want more detail on something that she covered. We'll go ahead and open it up.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
So looking at some of the resources that you
and one of the things I think about is this beginning part in our driver model around, especially around culture, around sharing life experiences. There's a number as a teacher and the students in your classroom, but whatever ideas you might have around how do we share life experiences, a lot of people are vulnerable first. And you come in and share things that mean a lot to you, maybe why you're in education, maybe why you got into teaching. The structure of how you share those things, there's a number of, if you Google restorative circles, a lot of times people give they will start those kind of conversations around what's called a restorative circle. So the classroom's in a circle. And a key thing in that is you want to have the circle without desks. You want to either be on the floor or be in chairs, and think about what you can start with about what you're bringing to the circle. And it's that piece as a teacher around being really vulnerable. And I've seen it done where it's a teacher who's white and all the students are students of color. And what they bring to the circle is their feeling about that, how that feels, and what they're sharing with them. And sometimes you'll do the circle, maybe one student will share and they'll all pass. But you give it time and students will start to share more authentic things.
Now, if I have multiple classes, should I try doing that with all of my classroom or all?
So I think it's totally up to you. I think what a lot of teachers will do is maybe try with one and see how it goes. The other thing that sometimes happens though is if kids are talking in different class periods and they hear that something happened in one, consistent. If you're a high school teacher and you're teaching 5 periods of math and you want to think about setting up that same structure for each class period for that day, I think the roles and responsibilities might become, if you go that route and you say, I want to think about setting up where kids have roles and responsibilities in the classroom, I would let the class drive what those roles and responsibilities are. So let them think about that's where it has to become a little bit more personalized for each classroom. Because you might have a classroom where one student says, hey, I think we should have a music coordinator, and somebody else says, I think we should be a little bit flexible in that. But the roles and responsibilities is one. The circles is another good way to start. I think that co-designing social leadership guidelines. So if you want to co-design with your class, what could be different leadership possibilities for the classroom, and be really open to their ideas. As a teacher, try super hard to spend the majority of your time listening. And it's hard for us as teachers.
So I have a comment and a question.
Great.
At DCISM, I want to put a plug in for them. They've been doing not what are they're calling them community circles, not restorative circles, because it's a regular practice every week in their classrooms and their advisories to do a touch base with their kids. And the kids are definitely getting a strong sense of belonging from being in those circles. My question is, I've heard somewhat of a criticism of relationship building that says that there's when teachers are developing relationships around cultural practices and personal experiences and honoring each other, that sometimes is a negative impact on academic behaviors and learning. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for how to keep the idea of the relationship building strong and the emphasis on academic learning strong together.
Yes, and I've definitely heard a similar thing. And I think that at the root of relationship building and cultural awareness is high expectations. They can't be one without the other. And I think there's a piece too, the community circles. First of all, big shout out to DCIS Montbello. That's awesome. The community circle is another great way to get started with restorative justice. But if you're not trying to restore something, you're just saying, here we all are. One thing we don't get away from them by just saying we're going to throw all the academics out the window, because hopefully what they're also doing in their classes is talking about their goals. And goals can also be a really good thing to talk about in those community circles. Like, what are my goals? How am I going to get there? And what are my challenges for trying to get there? But the academic piece and the high expectation piece, to me, I mean, when you have a high expectations for kids, I think you give them a lot of credit around that's a big piece of the relationship building. The minute I don't have any expectations for you as a student, or not high ones, that I start to wonder what kind of relationship that really even is.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for sharing that, because that was where my response has been. But I think it is a struggle for some teachers when they get kind of buddy with kids to remember that really they're there in a leadership and a facilitative way to support the relationships in order to reach these big academic goals that kids have.
Mhm. Exactly. Thanks.
Any other questions?
So I've got a question here. Is there kind of a place to start? Like, is there an order to the work that you guys are doing? Do you feel like the kind of the start is there something that we should do in the very beginning? Or, I mean, we talked a little bit about that, but like sometimes it's hard to find that space in the day to create relationships. So like, what would be the biggest step?
Great question, because we often get that time, when am I supposed to do this? My school isn't set up that I have advisory group, or I don't have, I need to teach 90 minutes of language arts. And so how do I ever do this? I think that there's a lot of power around these small groups and forming collaborative groups in your classroom. So if you can think in the front and kids working independently, really good place to start is to form collaborative groups, and within that give kids roles. So they start to just work with a few other kids. Recommendation is 4 or 5 in a group, not bigger than that. And they begin with roles. So that beginning might be that one person is the supply getter and somebody else is the recorder. And so they begin with some groups like that. And then you could have opportunities within there where they start to maybe do some peer reviews. And what you're building is this idea of being aware of others' learning needs. So it could also be a place where they share out as a group. One of the things we talk about a lot in our driver model is learner paths, and how do kids access, engage, and express information. So in this collaborative group, they could share with one another, this is the way I like to get information, this is the way I like to express the information. And what you're starting to do is build these underlying pieces of empathy about how one person gets information or wants to express it versus another. So you're beginning those beginning stages of sharing others' needs and being aware of others' needs. So elementary, middle school are times to be very, very self-absorbed. So it's beginning phases of having empathy for others.
Awesome. Meg, I have a question for you, because you've mentioned a few times the Growth Through Connections work.
Yeah.
Could you talk real briefly about what that program is within DPS, and then maybe a success and a challenge or kind of lesson learned that's come from the work?
Sure. So what happened is last January, we began a program called Growth Through Connections within the Imaginarium, and we worked with 9 teachers in 4 different schools. And we partnered also with Public Education and Business Coalition, PEBC, and along with a book to their actions. So the example would be, if I say my belief is that all students can learn, but when I come into your classroom, the 5 male students of color have their desks against the wall, then I begin to say, how are your beliefs of all students can learn connected to your actions? What we found last year with our teachers, these 9 teachers in Growth Through Connections, is it was a much better way to go about thinking about how my actions are so strong with what I do. So one thing that, and basically what you're getting at is biases, but what happens is, I think that none of us believe that we have or think about biases, and none of us truly want to not serve all kids. We all want to serve all kids, but sometimes we get caught up in our actions when they relate to behavior, and we don't think through it all. So it's this awareness check of what my actions in my classroom every day aligning with my beliefs. And then simultaneously, what we did with the 9 teachers is we did the book study around Christopher Emdin's book to start thinking about how do
Mention what a Cogent is.
Yeah, so a Cogent is a small group within within your classroom where they start to drive their own learning. They start to say what they want to learn. They start to give a lot of input as to how it's working and how it's how the education system's working for them, and particularly that classroom. Teachers from January to I guess we started in February until May of last year, they had some different chances to implement things in their classroom, and the feedback was great. One of the things that they said was, it's hard. It's really hard, and you have to really think through it every day. And I think that the hardest piece that we heard from teachers was letting go and actually being able to say to kids, hey, I want to let you run this. One example, we had a teacher who's white, and early on he said, I don't know what to do. I have these high school kids who are they all come totally different. He said, I don't listen to hip hop music. I don't rap. He's like, I wear Birkenstocks. I snowboard. And after about a week, he said, you know what I have in common with them? Humanity. And he put it out to them and he said, hey, this is who I am. I listen to Grateful Dead, I snowboard. And he said, so I want to learn from you. And he started asking them about hip hop music. He started asking them about rap. And they started sharing those experiences with him. And it's that piece, I think, for a lot of teachers where the hardest part is to be vulnerable. And how do I just say, hey, I don't know about your culture, so tell me about it, because I want to know. And so that was just a really great thing that we learned. The other thing that I know that we realized is that for a lot of teachers, like this whole idea of kids working in collaborative groups, a lot of teachers assume kids know how to do that. And what the things that came out in Growth Through Connections is teachers came back and said to us, I have to teach my kids how to do these things. And that's where this idea of roles and responsibilities to really teach kids how to work in a group. So Growth Through Connections, the first cohort ended, but they are continuing on this year. And the way it's looking this year is their schools leaders have become involved. And we're looking at it as a whole building. School leaders are looking at how their actions of their building align with their beliefs. And we're also bringing on another cohort 2. So we're going to be supporting another group of teachers. And the eventual goal is that these teachers in each of these buildings will be sharing their learning with their schools.
So I have one question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Rich.
Is there a specific way that you would have us measure our success? I mean, are we just looking for better behavior that we would want to evaluate whether this is going well or not going well?
So I think that's a great question. And I think one thing you can do is we go back to the driver model and you look and kind of self-assess yourself across the driver model in relationships and culture. But the other thing for me is you ask the students quick little surveys or in these community circles to ask them, how is it going? Have they been able to understand other learners' needs? Have they had opportunities in the class to share life experiences? And then for you as a teacher, maybe to just keep some data for yourself about, hey, we've been doing these and, these 5 kids have not once ever shared a life experience. How can I tie back into them a bit and collect your own data that way? But I think that ask the kids, ask the students what their feeling about it is.
And I wonder too, I know in Denver Public Schools, we have student perception surveys. And I wonder if some of the questions that they're being asked there about how safe they feel at school, how happy they feel at school, some of those if your scores might increase if you're doing this work really well.
Yeah.
That might be another data point to look at.
Could be a great one, yeah.
Awesome. Any other final questions before we close out? All right, so I'm going to
All
go
right,
back over.
so we'll see you next month.
Yeah, thank you all so much for joining us. We will have another monthly webinar each month. It's usually the first Tuesday of the month, but we'll send out invites. And we have scheduled many of them, but we also have a lot available. So if there's specific topics that you want us to focus on, you can email me, Laura_Mitchell@dpsk12.org. Thank you all so much. Hope to talk to you soon. And thank you, Meg, for
Thanks.
joining us. This was
Sure.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks, Meg. Thanks, Laura.